Of all the people you could have done a biography of, why Richard Nixon?
He's the historic figure, I think, that is the hottest button you can press right now of recent history. Great many people still remember him, even those who were too young to remember him exactly have heard an immense amount about him. There's huge interest in him. Basically, I think because now that emotionalism has subsided a bit, most everyone admits that he was a very talented president. It obviously ended badly, worse than any other presidency. And there is this combination of a failure on the part of his opponents to explain the Nixon phenomenon, how he got so far and lasted so long, and kept coming back to being a prominent figure. And on the other side, the fear that perhaps he was not fairly treated. And that he is a hot button, I thought, was particularly clearly proved when the Mark Felt affair arose and he identified himself as being threat. And add to that I remember the era well. I knew from watching the news most of Nixon's time as vice president and all his time after that, and I didn't know him for the last 5 years of his life. And I got quite a high degree of cooperation from the Nixon Library, the Nixon Center, which in fact I'm a trustee of.
He always seems to be underestimated.
Yeah, you see, this really happened with 1960. Prior to that, he was kind of the bright young man. You see, he was elected U.S. Senator in 1950. He was 37 years old against Helen, Gehig, and Douglas, and he won by 700,000 votes. He won the biggest margin of any Senate candidate. Now, it's the biggest state, but it was still a convincing victory by young men. And he was only 39 when he was brought in as vice president. He was actually just turned 40 when he was inaugurated. And he was a sort of bright, rather dynamic, well-regarded young person. But when he came up against the Kennedys, the whole game changed. And then he became, almost overnight, the little person, the awkward person, the sort of the little engine that tries hard, you know, and he was running against this very glamorous, very felicitous man with an extremely wealthy father, and they've been socially prominent for decades, going back to when they were in the embassy in London and so on. And JFK was billed as an authentic war hero. He had essentially the same war performance as Nixon in terms of rank and getting battle stars and so on, but he had that more dramatic thing with his boat being sunk and everything. And Nixon made a virtue of necessity, and he set himself at the head of Americans who might admire a kind of gracious, facile person like JFK, I mean, a person who always had a quip and was always had, you know, the right word, but identified with someone who was more awkward and, you know, physically awkward movements, and whose fluency was not quite as great as Kennedy's, and who came from quite a poor family, his wife an even poorer family, and he set himself at the head of tens of millions of Americans who identified with that. And they were half the people. I mean, he got half the votes in 1960. In fact, if you look at the popular vote, the Alabama vote, the Democrats, most of the Democrats were voting for Kennedy. They were voting for the Southern Democratic splinter group, you know, Senator Byrd. And really, Nixon won the popular vote. And whether he actually won the electoral vote is a matter that will never really be determined. But essentially, it was a drawn election, like Gore and George W. Bush. And so Nixon had half the people, and he almost had half the people. Even the day he went out in Watergate, he was only down to about 30%. And that was after being pounded mercilessly for years. He always had a huge number of very ordinary people who identified with Nixon as they thought, an ordinary man who'd done well. Now, of course, he seemed ordinary, but he wasn't, because he was very intelligent. There's not the slightest doubt, of course, extremely persevering, but there's not the slightest doubt that he was at least as intelligent as Kennedy. He just wasn't presentationally as good.
One last question.
your critics are going to say, this is a biography of America's Machiavelli written by Canada's Machiavelli. Why set yourself up for something like that?
You mustn't, in my opinion, fail to do things out of fear. You should do things or not do things for the right reasons and not the wrong ones. I would have no problem whatsoever dealing with any criticism like that. I'm not a Machiavelli. I'm a relatively straightforward person. I mean, one thing you do if you do a serious amount of research leading to a 400,000-word book about Richard Nixon is you get a fair idea of what his personality is like. And I say this with no invidious way. I'm not presuming to compare myself to a man who was, after all, twice the vice president and twice the president of the U.S., but my character isn't in the slightest bit like his.
I found I liked you both better at the end of the book. Nixon and you.
I can't comment on myself, but on Nixon, I think, I obviously have no idea, no standing to say how you might have thought of him before, but after I'd finished, I liked him better too, even though I knew him in his last 5 years, and I liked him from how I knew him, but I knew him really when the terribly controversial part of his career was over. A very nice man when I knew him, good sense of humor, very courteous, very amusing, and startlingly intelligent.
The book is The Invincible Quest, The Life of Richard Milhouse Nixon. I've been speaking with the author, Conrad Black, and The Invincible Quest is published by McClelland and Stewart.